Coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition, and welcome to Midday with Rev Don. And as you know, if you follow this program, whatever platform you may be watching it on, if you type your questions or comments there, they'll appear in my chat room and we can interact directly. And I come on this program every day. I love this time that I spend with you. I love you all. I love interacting directly with you. And I'm available for anyone. And so last night, I did Tarot Thursday here on Pagan World. That was delightful. It was an hour of mini readings for people. And it was quite enjoyable. It was very reminiscent of old times for me. I was a psychic reader on the fair circuits for many, many years. And hello to Bradley in the chat room. Hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room. And doing that sort of fast reading was something that I often did as a presentation for people. And of course, it's my reading style in general. I am not one for long, drawn-out reading processes. I prefer the faster style of drawing one card after another and just going that way. Of course, I also do clairvoyant readings. And if you'd like a reading with me, you can book one by contacting me at donlewishp@aol.com or by instant messenger at Facebook or Instagram. And I am always available for readings. I enjoy doing readings, and people usually feel pretty good about those readings. And so that's available. Today, I wanted to continue my talk about the Parliament of the World's Religions and their call to conscience, defending freedom and human rights. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say about that. And I invite you to comment in the chat room. But I think I want to start by saying, freedom and human rights is a very important thing. It's something a lot of people spend a lot of time talking about. Hello, Janet in the chat room. A lot of people spend a lot of time working on it. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. And hello to Kelvin in the chat room. But it doesn't seem to mean the same thing to everyone. That's natural to some extent. We're all different. We all come from our different perspectives. I think one of the things that people sometimes do when they talk about things like freedom and human rights, they're thinking first and foremost about their own freedom and their own rights as they perceive them, and not necessarily so quick to think about other people's. And I think if we want to take seriously the Parliament call to conscience, to look at defending freedom and human rights, it isn't our own necessarily that we should be thinking about. And hello to Kazan in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kazan. I sometimes mention the dramatized or the novelization of the original Battlestar Galactica from the late 70s. And in this novel, they are on a planet that seems very paradisal to them, very paradisical. And the main character, Commander Adama, makes the comment that when most people think of paradise, all they think about is getting their own needs met, and don't necessarily think about how that's happening or why it's happening. And I think we're all guilty of that to some extent. I've been guilty of that. I have been more guilty of that than I was certainly aware at many points in life, but I think this is part of our human condition. Magical Mermaid says abuse of freedom is a real thing. That's true. But again, what constitutes that is not a universal point of view. Brian, who follows this program, has pointed out on several occasions that considering that their theme, their call to conscience, is defending freedom and human rights, there's no appreciable LGBTQ programming. And this is a major front in human rights around the world, particularly in Africa, for example, where there are some very draconian laws coming in against the LGBTQ community, and other parts of the world as well. And so you would think there'd be at least a little more commentary on that. And I think that for us, what the Parliament presents, what it does not present, is influenced by so many things, including what they can present without overturning their own apple cart. But I think that when we look at the idea of defending freedom and human rights, we have to look at it holistically. And if we truly wish to adapt this as part of our lives, it's not enough to think about ourselves. We have to think about other people and what they need. And of course, the problem with that is there's so many other people, and sometimes their ideas conflict drastically. And how do you deal with that? And that, to some extent, this is a question, I think, now for younger minds than mine. But it is, I think, the question of the age. When people clash over what they want to see, how does the future take shape? How does it respect the freedom and the human rights of everyone involved? Particularly when some people think their rights are eliminating the rights of others. And Lori Jo, hello Lori Jo, it's good to see you, says those draconian laws being introduced in Africa are imported from American evangelicals, and this is absolutely true. This is absolutely true, and we also see that sort of thing happening here. And Bradley says, I think as you will with harm to none speaks greatly to human rights. I think do as you will with harm toward none speaks greatly to human rights. People should be able to live life to the fullest without being told what they can and cannot do unless they are causing harm. And at one level, that is a great answer. And when pursuing our Corellian peace campaign, one of the things I talked about repeatedly is that peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability of people to go forward, living their life as they see fit, as long as they are not harming anyone. And the problem, however, comes in that not everyone agrees on what is harm. And we see that with the recent moral panic about drag queens. And it is very obvious two sides have a drastically different view of what is harm. Now, I will take a moment to point out that drag has been part of American culture going back at least to the mid-19th century. It's been a big part of American culture. I'm not sure even before that it wasn't already there. In fact, I imagine that it was because it's part of the British heritage in things like pantomimes. And so it's hardly something new, but this country and the world goes through frequent moral panics. And often they get upset about what's always been there because they're looking for something to be upset about. And I think we have to regard, when we talk about a moral panic, that it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what they're actually upset about. I'll give you an example, and that's the satanic panic of the late 1980s and 1990s. It was obvious from the start that the accusations being made were not true for a variety of reasons, including how quickly that some of them were disproven, the fact that some of them were not physically possible, but people chose to believe them anyway and to move forward. And this is kind of breathtaking. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. And it does speak to the irrationality that people sometimes manifest. And when we look at freedom and human rights, that irrationality is part of the world's problem. And what do we do about that? As spiritual people, there are techniques of spiritual healing that might make a difference. But people cannot necessarily be healed of what they will not permit themselves to be healed from. And it seems that people just like going off the rails every now and then. And what do you do with that? I think, again, part of it's human nature. Most commonly, I mean, there are abuses of human rights in the world that are chronic and endemic. The way women have been treated historically is chronic and endemic. The way people of color have been treated historically in much of the world is chronic and endemic. And then there are other things that are flare-ups. Certain prejudices will just flare into violence at certain times, such as the witch hunts. Which, I mean, who would have thought when I was young that we would be talking about witch hunts as a part of the contemporary world, but they very much are. Even in this country, because I spoke of the Satanic Panic, and what was that but a witch hunt? And one that was created out of situations that never existed. It is a strange feature, apparently, of human life. But when we look at defending freedom, when we look at defending human rights, we have to consider that. We can incrementally work on chronic situations. Although I'm sure that anyone who suffers from chronic oppression will say that incrementalism is not necessarily what they would like to see. But it is one thing that can happen. But with these sudden flare-ups, incrementalism is no help, because they also pass relatively quickly, usually within a few years. The current anti-drag flare-up will probably have passed within a few years, just like the Satanic Panic passed within a few years. But look how many people were destroyed in the meantime. We could think of a dozen or more similar flare-ups throughout the 20th century. There was the anti-communist flare-up of the mid-20th century, which damaged a lot of people who were not even communists. Now, which started with a corrupt congressman using an outdated list that did not even reflect contemporary reality. To pursue an agenda that was really all about promoting himself. I think he was a congressman, maybe he was a senator. It was before my time. But I'm referring, of course, to McCarthyism. But we see these things, and look how many careers were destroyed by that, many of which had little or nothing to do with even what they were accused of. These are some of the things that plague us when it comes to defense of freedom and human rights. And that balance between what some people consider their freedom to be prejudiced or to discriminate versus what others consider their human rights not to be discriminated against is a very difficult thing for some people. Now, it seems to me that it's simple enough to say, if you don't want to read the book, don't read it. But these are complex questions sometimes, and again, I feel it falls really to a younger generation to answer it, because neither my generation or the one before us has been able to do so. And I think that we need to kind of recognize that we have failed in that. Sometimes I feel very hopeful for that younger generation. And sometimes I feel like people are people. And Calvin says, you're absolutely correct. The challenge is getting everyone to agree to disagree and move forward living in peace within their communities. However, I'm afraid that we will continue down this slippery slope of beliefs, be it national or international, until our newer generations come together to force changes by putting the right representatives in public office, be it local as well as national. Now, Ravenwolf says, I had the not so fun experience the other day of people taking issue with me based on how I look. And I think a lot of us have had that experience at some point in life. I've rarely had anyone directly criticize how I look, but I've certainly seen that some people have had certain prejudices. I remember a time in my early 20s, and I was on a bus in, I think, Toledo, Ohio, and an elderly woman got on. And she seemed like a very nice lady. I smiled at her. And it was obvious that she was afraid and or offended that I had smiled at her. And I thought about that, and yes, I was a very large man with a full beard and long hair, and maybe she was afraid. The purpose of smiling was to overcome that. But, people react as they react. And they do react to appearance. And this is one of the reasons I talk about being mindful of our appearance. But sometimes there's nothing we can do. Magical Mermaid says, even Christians oppose other Christians based on their branches and beliefs. And that is certainly true. It's also true of pagans and Wiccans. And it just raises the question, can we ever move beyond this? Can we get better about this? And, the obvious first step is to resolve that we wish to do so and that we're going to try to do so. And when we see things in our lives that we could do better at, maybe we've even done extremely poorly, what we need to do is make that resolution that we will do better. And in this moment, and I hope you'll join me in what I'm about to say and the sentiment of what I'm about to say. In this moment, I make a resolution to do better those things that I have done badly. Those bad behaviors I have not seen, whether it's prejudices or unconscious prejudices or whatever it may be. In this moment, I resolve that I will do better. I will be mindful. I will see what I have not seen previously. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, I ask you to help to make this true and real and complete. And I hope that we can all do that. Because I think that's the only thing that's going to move us forward. And is it enough? Of course it's not enough. We actually have to follow through with it. We actually have to mean it. We have to do our best, and even then, it's a slow road. When I was young, people seemed to think that we were really on the road to a better world in our own lifetime. And in some ways, I think that we have done that. In others, in some ways, I'd almost say we've gone backwards at the same time. I guess that's part of human nature, part of human life, but it's not the future that I expected. I expected things to just continue to improve as people worked to get better. But I guess if you have a wound that has not been cleaned, it will remain infected until eventually it is drained and healed. Maybe that's what's happening in the world. But I think we have to assume that fight for a better world, that fight for defending freedom and human rights is going to be ongoing for a long, long time, if not eternal. Magical Mermaid says we all many times have natural prejudices based on environments and conditioning experiences. I think that's very true. I think even when we're trying really hard to move forward, um, well, and let's say particularly in dealing with people who are different from ourselves, um, we have prejudices that we're not conscious of. We may have behaviors we're not conscious of. And we need to find ways to become conscious of that. We need to find ways to fix that. And there we are. And Kazan says, if you make a mistake, next time think twice before doing or saying something. And yes, that's true. It's important as we go forward to try and be conscious of where we have made our mistakes. And as a people, as a world, if we could do that, we would move forward much better. As I was saying, in the peace campaign, one of the things I talked about is that peace is not just the absence of conflict. A lot of people make that mistake. Peace cannot exist without justice. Peace cannot exist without people being treated according to their character, according to their acts, rather than just how they look or who they're perceived to be. Peace is when everybody has a chance at a decent life. The mere absence of visible conflict can actually be the exact opposite of peace. It can be pure oppression, because some of those very oppressive countries on the surface appear to be more peaceful than anyone because everyone's afraid to do anything. And that is not peace. So as we look at that call to conscience, I think we have to be very aware of what it actually means. And I do think the point that Brian has repeatedly made, that there doesn't seem to be much effort to look at this in light of the LGBTQ community in the parliamentary context, is also something that we need to take into consideration. Maybe it was simply an oversight because of a blind spot. Maybe it was a political consideration. But it does speak to why there are ongoing problems. And I'm sure that we can all find places in our own lives where we've done the same type of thing, where we've ignored something that was obvious because we did not see it. And I'm going to go back for a moment to the Satanic Panic. As I understand it, the very first person to start making these Satanic Panic accusations turned out to have hallucinatory mental illness. And yet that person was taken literally. Again, many of the accusations that were made were things that could not have happened physically, but they were taken seriously. One that I remember was a man named Dale Akiki. And this man had a facial disfigurement. He worked at his local church. And he came under accusations of satanic ritual abuse. And one of the accusations was that he had brought a live elephant into the church, sacrificed it on the high altar, and had everything cleaned up for programming at 5 p.m. Now, there were no elephants missing in the first place. It would be extremely difficult to clean something like that up that quickly and leave no sign behind. And of course, contemporary forensic technology, even then, could easily detect the presence of blood. You could not clean it up and have it not show. It would still be there in its trace forms. And apparently no one even bothered to look. And this actually went forward to trial. Now, Dale Akiki was acquitted, but he was at the tail end of the Satanic Panic. And the minister of the church, when he heard this testimony, it clicked in his mind, that's not possible. And he changed his own belief, which did help to secure the acquittal of Dale Akiki. But it took an accusation that extreme and that ridiculous for anyone to question it in a serious way. You know, there are still some people in prison because they accepted plea bargains because they didn't believe they could successfully defend themselves, even though they were innocent. And everyone now pretty much agrees that this was all made up. But because they took a plea bargain, they're stuck for however long they bargained for. This really is a national disgrace, but hardly ever thought of. It was a massive miscarriage of justice, and only one of many. And when we talk about defending freedom and human rights, we need to look at things like this. There are a lot of people who would love to see the Satanic Panic come back. We see them try it every now and then. I remember another instance that happened in Australia 10, 15 years ago. There was a pastor there who tried to create a moral panic because he discovered a human sacrifice site in a public park with blood all around. Blood turned out to be like a cherry soda or something like that. There was nothing resembling blood. It didn't even look like dried blood. It looked like dried cherry soda. And nobody bit that time. But, you know, the person trying to make the accusation didn't even bother to check out what the substance was. They reached this drastic conclusion because they wanted to. People do that all the time. If we look at some of the horrible massacres in our nation's history and around the world, it's often over some foolish assumption that did not even actually happen, or happen the way that it was portrayed. And people died or lost their livelihood because of it. And I think we've tried to create a world of law that prevents that sort of thing. And it's very disheartening to see so many people, it seems, trying to weaken those laws to make that sort of thing more possible again. And trying to introduce these draconian laws in various parts of the world. For us, as members of a minority of religion, who could very easily be a target of exactly such an attack, we really need to be aware of this. And we need to be working to combat it, not only on the part of others, but on our own part, and to make sure that we are behaving reasonably, make sure that we are treating people properly. As I say, I have certainly done many things in my life that I wish, in looking back, I had done differently, and I'm sure we all have. So I'm simply saying, let us reflect on that and resolve to do better. And with that, that concludes our half hour. Thank you so much for being here. I love all of you. I'm sorry that this was perhaps a heavy subject today, but defending freedom and human rights really is a heavy subject. It's wonderful when you portray it as a victory march toward a glorious future. But what it really is a long slog. And I think we need to be mindful of that and embrace the fact that it's work, that it's not all simple and easy. So thank you. And I love you all. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again on Monday. And with that, let us close with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we ask you to help us as we go forward, to be mindful of our actions, and to avoid actions which are destructive or harmful to others. And if in the past we have not seen this, help us to see it in the future. Help us to do the next right thing, if we have not done the last right thing. And if we have done the last right thing, help us to continue to do so. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and respect, and knowing you are always with us. But from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I love you all, and may you be blessed now and always.